Good afternoon. It's afternoon my time. I don't know what time it is in Athens, Greece right now, but before I get started, I want to thank the 14th Annual International Conference on Sociology for inviting me to give this talk on the constitution and origins of consciousness, not only in sociology, but also in how it ties to the physics. Before I get started, I pay homage to my ancestors, the father of my country, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, my grandparents, Eugenia and Saïd Mocombe, who taught me the ways of the ancestors. And before I get started, just one socio-political thought. As we in Haiti have learned that, and not only in Haiti, but also the philosophy of science has taught us that we were not allowed to impose any worldview on the physical objective reality that we experience as a species. That being said, we should take heed to the fact that what we're experiencing currently, which is why we're unable to convene in Athens, Greece, is not only a worldwide pandemic, but it's also an attack on the American Protestant capitalist liberal model that we're trying to impose on the world. It threatens not only nature, but it also threatens us as a species and all species on Earth. Anyway, the title of my talk, that being said, the title of my talk is Psychion, Qualia, Consciousness, and the Constitution of Mind, and Paul C. Mocombe's theory of phenomenological structuralism. My theory of phenomenological structuralism was developed as part of my doctoral work to understand the nature and origins of consciousness, not only from a sociological perspective, but also trying to tie that sociological perspective to the conception of consciousness, constitution, as thought out in the physical science, i.e. physics. So phenomenological structuralism, it begins as a critique of structurationist sociology. And by structurationist sociology, I include such theorists as Anthony Giddens and his theory of structuration theory, Marshall Sahlins in anthropology with his notion of mythopraxis, Jürgen Habermas and Habermas's theory of communicative discourse, as well as Pierre Bourdieu's also structurationist theory of capital, cultural, habitus, etc. And the problem that I argue that these theorists have, all of them constitute, is that they attempt to resolve the structural agency problematic of the social sciences, but at the same time, in attempting to do so, they reproduce the problem of agency, human agency. And what do I mean by they reintroduce the concept of human agency? They reintroduce the problem in a different form, because what they do is they show the praxis of the human agent as we internalize and recursively reorganize and reproduce the social structure in which we find ourselves evolving in. So, for example, Anthony Giddens, by arguing that we internalize social facts or the ideas of social structures, and then we recursively reorganize them and reproduce them in our material praxis, well, all he's saying then is we internalize the social structure and reproduce them in material praxis. How have you resolved the structure agency problematic? You've just turned the individual into a product of social structure or social fact. Same thing with Bourdieu and our internalization of habitus and the different forms of capital. And even if you read Bourdieu's work, all it is we internalize the dominant capital of the social structure, be it linguistic, cultural, social, etc., and we recursively reorganize them in different differentiation based on our means of obtaining those capitals or the habitus we occupy. Habermas might be a little more, his theory of communicative discourse more so, in my mind, attempts to, he does a better job of resolving the issue than Solons, than Bourdieu, than Anthony Giddens. For Habermas, the life world is separate from the system, and within the life world, we were able to constitute different forms of life, if we may use that George Simmel's word, different forms of life from that of the system. But Habermas also is problematic because for Habermas, the colonization of the life world is a dysfunction as opposed to the nature of how the system is constituted. In my view, the system is constituted based on the colonization of the life world. Habermas sees that as a legitimation crisis, so to speak. That being said, I also, so, and if we may just an aside and talk about Marshall Solons, for example, Marshall Solons and his attack or his critique of how the ancient Hawaiians viewed Captain Cook's arrival into the Polynesian islands by viewing him as a god. What he's arguing is that the ancient Hawaiians internalized the mythopraxis of their society. They recursively reorganized it and reproduced it in their praxis, and therefore when they encountered Captain Cook, their worldview did not allow to see him any sort of way outside of their mythopraxis, which for me is again the same problem we find in Anthony Giddens, Habermas, as well as Pierre Bourdieu. So in my attempt to reconceptualize the nation of consciousness, and we have to remember, in all of those four worldviews, consciousness is viewed as practical activity or practical consciousness, to use Anthony Giddens' term. So I hold on to the notion of practical consciousness as the means by which we recursively reorganize and reproduce our being in the world. But for me, there are four forms of practical consciousness that the human being recursively reorganize and reproduce in the world. The first one is the fact that the individual is constituted based on what I call the Psychion of subatomic particles. So what I attempt to do is to reconnect sociology, which I view as a pseudoscience, to physics, which I view as a science. Now, in order to do so, the reason I do so, none of the four worldviews attempt to connect consciousness to the physics of consciousness. Where does consciousness come from materialistically? So this is where I begin. For me, you have to go back to the origins, to the core. Where does consciousness comes from? Is consciousness a fundamental to the universe, or is it an emergent property? Now, in physics, there are two approaches to understanding the notion of consciousness in the universe. The first position views consciousness as fundamental to the universe. So therefore, building on notions of quantum superposition, quantum entanglement, wave function realism, and I won't go into them to not confuse the audience, wave function realism, as well as M theory, or the Hawking paradox as well. The notion is that we are an illusion, consciousness is an illusion, that's Daniel Dennett's position. But along the same lines of Dennett's position, Dennett wants to consider himself a physicalist, I don't. Anyway, along those same lines, consciousness is viewed as fundamental to the universe. It's repeating the old position of George Berkeley, his moniker SAS percipi, to be is to be perceived. So therefore, we are a perception. So in that initial position, we are an emergent perception in the mind of a creator that created the universe. So therefore, consciousness must be fundamental to the universe, and then we are a product of that of that consciousness. Whether if you want to use some theorists who want to argue that consciousness is our consciousness is a result of a higher consciousness, and we are simply a simulation and a program of a higher consciousness, or we are a consciousness in the mind of God. So in that position, consciousness is fundamental to the universe. The second position is a physicalist position. The physicalist position says consciousness is emergent. And we built on Hugh Everett's notion of multiverses to understand that consciousness is just an emergent property of the universe as a result of physical laws and the constitution of those physical laws within a particular within a particular position that allows us to emerge as conscious being, and this consciousness allows us to experience the material world constituted by the laws of physics. Now, both positions are problematic. The first is you have to suppose that there's a conscious being that created the universe, and we are, if you adopt Hawkins' paradox, we are a hologram of the perception of that higher being. And that we could easily disprove it. I could just kick my pool table or touch my pool table, and we're not a hologram. I side with the physicalist position. My position, hence Psychion, I believe that consciousness, and in order for me to constitute this position, I also build on, this is a different interpretation from the notion of superposition, wave function realism, quantum entanglement, in M theory, as well as in Haitian metaphysics, this notion that we are a product of a parallel world, or the spirits created a parallel universe. So from my position, what I argue is that consciousness is actually a material thing, what I call a psion. And the phenomenal properties of that subatomic particle, which I call a psion, is what A.J. Ayers calls qualia. Qualia is the subjective nature of consciousness. What we call the solved problem, the hard problem of consciousness, that subjective experience of consciousness, of ideas, of the world, and how we experience. A.J. Ayers calls that qualia. So for me, consciousness is at the subatomic particle, evolves out of what I call in M theory, a superverse. And out of that superverse, we have a bubble of multiverses. And out of this multiverse, Psychion is an emergent subatomic particle. So we have the four forces of the universe: the strong and weak nuclear force, gravity, and electromagnetism. The constitution of these four forces creates the universe. And in the creation of the universe, or the multiverse, we get psions being an emergent property of aggregated beings experiencing simultaneous superposition objective worlds. So what we have is the superverse, and this accounts for Einstein's theory of relativity on a general level. So we have a superverse that produced multiverses with the four forces of nature, and these multiverses produce beings who experience these the aggregated world. As a result of experiencing these aggregated world, consciousness emerges. The experience of these beings experiencing these multiverse simultaneously. So in this logic, past, present, and future are happening at the same time within multiverses. So as we experience these things as aggregated matter, and we develop, consciousness emerges from the experiences of these simultaneous existing multiverses. And when matter disaggregate, consciousness becomes a psion within the superverse and produces and therefore it becomes an emergent property of the superverse. We embody, when we are aggregated as matter, these subatomic particles, and our experiences continue to exist even after matter disaggregation. And this is in keeping with the laws of Hawking's paradox, the laws of thermodynamics, energy is neither created nor destroyed, etc. And therefore, once we are aggregated, we are constituted as four aspects of consciousness. The first is the subatomic particles, the scions of these subatomic particles in the phenomenal properties, what Ayers call qualia. The second is that our body itself has practical consciousness. Our desires for food, clothing, if you want to call it Maslow's hierarchy of need. At the basis of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Our bodies, our constituted bodies have their own practical activities, practical consciousness that drives us. The third would be social systems. So if you look at it, we're emerging from subatomic particles, scions, with phenomenal properties, qualia, aggregated as a body with its own practical activities, practical consciousness, within a system constituted by four systems. What I call ideology, ideological apparatuses, language, and motor production and communicative discourse. And we are, to use Heidegger's term, we're thrown into social systems as well, which gives us a third form of practical consciousness or practical activity. So first form of practical consciousness comes from these scions with phenomenal properties, which I call qualia. Second form, the body, the aggregated body itself has its practical activity, practical consciousness. The third is the social system that gives us practical activity and practical consciousness. And then the fourth I would call the ability to defer meaning and ego-centered communicative discourse. So in my system, there is technically no free will. I'm what you would call a soft determinist. So free will is a result in my system of our ability to defer meaning and ego-centered communicative discourse once we are within social systems. But all of these constitute phenomenal properties of Psychion. So this is my attempt to connect the physics of consciousness with the biology of consciousness and with the sociology of consciousness and with the language of consciousness. And this, for me, explains not only the origins of consciousness, but also how we recursively reorganize the consciousness in material praxis. Now, and I'm looking to end. We can falsify my theory on based on two things. First, we have to disprove whether or not there are multiverses. And currently we're in the process of searching for them. Mathematically, we can account for multiverses. Now, do they exist in physical reality? I believe they do. So once we're able, in Haitian Vodou, we say the spirits that embody human beings claim that they come from parallel universes, alternate universes, etc. So we have to attempt to falsify my theory by continuing to look for the actual nature of these multiverses if they exist. The second way we need to disprove my theory is whether or not God exists. If God exists, if a creator existed, then we've disproved one aspect of my theory, and I'm willing to accept the proposition that there is a creator, but that doesn't negate the fact that our consciousness stems from that creator through Psychion, through phenomenal properties, etc. Also, the origins of free will is also an aspect of problematic, which we equate in sociology with agency. For me, agency, free will, is only a product of our ability to defer meaning and ego-centered communicative discourse. If that's the only way we're able to have free will, I argue. Others may want to disprove that. I don't know. And so those are the two aspects or the two ways we can disprove or falsify my position. So that being the case, I as you all can see, my wife is videotaping this in my pool room. We're unable to meet or travel to Greece because of COVID-19, but I will answer questions if they're posted in the comment section of the YouTube video. So if we have any questions, any comments, etc., I will upload it onto the International Sociological Conference website. And I thank you all for sitting through this dense presentation. Thank you.